Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Hi, I'm Gabe Lyons. Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. And today we're talking about the environment, we're talking about climate change, and we're talking about it with an expert, a guy named Dr. Rusty Pritchard. He serves as Vice President of Advocacy and Influence at Tearfund USA, a Christian organization working to end global poverty. But more than that, Rusty's an old friend of mine. He goes back to the first days when we were creating the vision for the Q Conference, the first one we did in Atlanta. I'm going to get into that with him. We're going to talk about what we were trying to do there when we were trying to help people understand environmental stewardship at a time when the environment discussion was not something that was part of normal dialogue. It really wasn't. The church wasn't talking about it. People weren't really aware of terms like climate change. In fact, global warming would have been the term back then people were using. But we started to bring that conversation to the fore. And what I've always loved about Rusty is just this balanced approach. There's a lot of debate about different elements of climate change and how do you end it and what are the right policies. So I want to ask him about some of those. We'll talk about the Green New Deal. We'll talk a little bit about climate skepticism. We'll talk about Al Gore. I mean, we're going to get into everything. I think you're going to love it. And let's listen in now to my conversation with Rusty. Rusty, it is so great to have you on the Q Podcast.
I'm really glad to join you today, Gabe.
Listen, you've been such a good friend to me. I mean, I go back. You and I, 2006, we first met when we were both in Atlanta. You were at Emory, and you were one of the first Christians I knew who could explain to me environmental issues, stewardship, why this matters, why Christians ought to care the most about our creation and taking good care of it. And it's funny to even think back that that wasn't a normal conversation 15 years ago in the widest circles, but today it is. But you've been thinking about it for a long time. How did you first get into this conversation?
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting because I'm not a natural environmentalist. In fact, I think you remember that I've corrected you a few times when you've called me an environmentalist. I mean, that seems like it's a kind of movement with a political ideology. And I would like to say that just by reading scripture and movement of the Holy Spirit, I came to a great appreciation for creation. But really, I came at it through my discipline, which is economics. It's a study of how people make a living on Earth. And there's so much about economics that's about doing things in a smart way rather than a dumb way, making sure that you account for the total impacts of what you're doing, that you don't do things that have side effects on people that aren't part of what your enterprise is without actually paying for the side impacts that you've caused. Like there's so much in economic theory that leads you to say, okay, well, environment is an area where there are problems and economics can help address them. And it was only after beginning to ask those questions that I kind of went back and reread scripture all the way through and looked at the ways in which the Bible talks about the environment, talks about creation, and came to a much deeper understanding then of how central it is to discipleship. It's not just a matter of smart business practices.
Yeah, and it's been such a big part of your calling and assignment. I mean, you've helped so many leaders better understand how to think about this well, how to think about it biblically with a great theological foundation. And you were doing that for us. I mean, that was 2007. I remember the first Q we did in Atlanta at the Tabernacle. And you were helping us work through how to make it carbon neutral, right? How could we just make sure the way that we actually did that event, and at the time, again, we were having to explain to people what that would mean, but we weren't going to do water bottles, right? We were going to give people glasses and have them drink water a different way than what was just the norm. And we weren't going to print things that weren't recyclable. And there was just a lot of intention around it. And I just think, fast forward now, so many years, you've helped so many people really make this part of their normal way of thinking. I want you to describe, you talked at Q back 2 years ago, our Q event, an incredible talk on mapping environmental justice. And it was this idea, or injustice, mapping environmental injustice. And you were showing us these visuals of a city, and I think it was Atlanta.
It was
because
Atlanta.
That's where you're at. And you were helping people see visually how environmental injustice happens. And I think for some people, they hear that term and they think, wait, is that real? There's a skepticism about, there's a whole skepticism movement, obviously, around climate change that's very political and very much oriented towards what policies really work, what won't work. Is this man-made? How much of it's really man-made? How much of it's just the cycle of the world, and those whole conversations that in some circles are completely settled, other circles not so much. And yet we could all look at a map and we could see that there's injustice that's happening around how the environment is built, how structures are built, and the way that we view our cities. And I think what that did is it brought the conversation back to real, tangible people and how they're affected, and how we think and build starts to affect things. So do your best to describe for us a little bit about how we can map environmental justice in our cities and what that means to you.
Yeah, it's really interesting that we have now, as a society, come to grips with the idea of pollution. Like, that's not a mysterious thing. Even though we might not see pollution, it might not be visible, we understand that there are these local impacts of decisions that we make. Like, the example that I used was where to site hazardous waste dump sites. And the examples that we looked at showed that the vast majority of those environmental waste dumping sites that leach into the groundwater toxins, that off-gas chemicals into the atmosphere that affect local neighborhoods, so many of them are located in districts and regions that are predominantly African American or Asian or Latino. And that was the map that we looked at. It came from Leroy Barber and I, who were doing church together in South Atlanta, sort of traveling through the neighborhood and seeing just how many intensely polluting facilities there were in the mostly African American neighborhood where we served. And we decided to get on the EPA database that lets you map where toxic facilities are located. That's gas stations and recycling centers, which sounds like a green, clean thing, but is not really when it actually finds expression on the landscape. Hazardous waste dump stations, transfer stations for municipal waste. So many things that pollute the atmosphere were located in the neighborhood where we were working. So much so that Leroy jokingly said, there's this movement to not allow these facilities in your backyard, saying not in my backyard. He said, everything's in my backyard. So
isn't dry cleaners is another one? I remember
dry cleaners has often been another one. There are dry cleaners that are starting to use chemicals that are better for the environment, but you don't really want to live upstairs from a dry cleaners.
Yeah.
But when we started mapping it, and then we looked at, with a really neat tool, where different races are settled in Atlanta. You could look at different parts of town. You could see the historic redlining that occurred that put African Americans in one part of the town and whites in another part of the town. But then more recently, recent immigrants have settled in particular geographies in Atlanta. And when you overlay those two maps, what you see is that there is a clear racial dimension to the location of those toxic facilities. So everybody, in a sense, benefits from some of those toxic facilities, because I can buy products from companies that can send their waste somewhere to be treated or disposed of, and it gets it out of their hair, out of their neighborhood. I benefit from the products, but the harms are heaped up on particular people.
And what do we do about that? I mean, is it one of those things where those particular areas are less expensive to buy real estate in, and therefore it attracts a poorer community that can buy into those spaces? Or is it one where cities are mapping and telling these types of businesses that they need to go set up shop in these particular areas because they feel like they'll get the least amount of pushback?
Yeah, the idea of people being politically disempowered and not being able to push back is probably a real driver of why these industries are concentrated in certain areas. Real estate prices is another reason. But even when you control for those things, you still see a kind of racial disparity in where things are located. And that's obviously not fair, but it's a symbol of broken relationships at a really broad scale, that we are we are involved in an industrial production system that ends up producing things that we consider waste or pollution that don't do anybody any good, and we don't know how to capture those and reuse those as part of our industrial system. Now, we've gotten better at this since we started asking companies to take more responsibility for their pollution. There are no longer pipes with open sewage flowing into our waterways as there were in the 1940s and 50s. Our air is so much cleaner, Gabe, than it was in the 1950s and 60s because of the Clean Air Act that was passed in 1970. And what we've seen is that through those prudent measures where people come together in a bipartisan way and decide that we really want to clean up our environment, we make tremendous strides. So if you were to measure in 2020 what the benefit of the Clean Air Act is for the American economy, I think we've avoided something like $3.8 trillion of damages just this year because we passed the Clean Air Act in 1970, revised it. George Bush passed some amendments that made it stronger in 1990. And now it's functioning for the benefit of everybody because we came together to find a solution to this common problem.
Yeah, it's great to hear the stories of where there's been bipartisan action on things that really benefit human beings and our flourishing. You work for an international relief and development organization, and you guys respond to disasters. You do so much work that's long-term community development, but you also talk a lot about climate change. And I'd love for you to describe, where you see the climate change role in how environmental injustice takes place, or even in the development work that you're doing around the world. How are people being affected by climate change?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar, but in a sense, scaled up from those local pollution problems that we were talking about. We share a common atmosphere with the entire globe and a common climate system. And when it starts to go haywire, it affects the people who are most directly dependent on creation. For example, farmers, the most. People who live in very marginal situations, in very vulnerable landscapes where there's frequent fires and floods and droughts. Those kinds of natural disasters, those kinds of threats become much more common with climate change. And we in the U.S. can buffer ourselves from some of those. Although, we're starting to see and have some solidarity with the rest of the world that the effects that climate change has are really starting to hit us in our country as well. You saw with the fires out west, with back-to-back hurricanes repeatedly here in the east, that things are coming home to roost now, and we actually aren't able to completely buffer ourselves from environmental vicissitudes. Because we work with poor farmers all over the world, we hear stories about people who can't grow the crops that they used to grow, people whose yields have declined, people who are subject to pests that they have never experienced before. And all over the world, folks are attributing that to a changing climate. They say, we don't know when the rain is going to come anymore. We used to be able to predict, get our crops in the ground, know that rain was going to come and water those crops. These are farmers who can't afford pumps and irrigation for their fields. So they're really feeling the impact in their pocketbooks and in the ability of their kids to flourish, to have adequate nutrition, to attend school in a really good shape. And those things are commonplace in the developing world, and people talk quite openly about climate change. And they've asked us, why aren't you talking about it in your country? Tearfund started in the UK, has spread to many other developed countries like the US, and farmers in Tanzania who are experiencing difficulty growing crops kind of know a little bit about how the climate system works, and they know that we should be doing our part to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change.
Yeah, and that obviously has created the skepticism and the debate around climate change and climate change deniers, right? Is this man-made or not, right? And how much can we really impact it? How much can we control it? When there were seasons where there wasn't rain, we used to just call it a drought, right? We didn't always tack it up to this is climate change or something that we can control. It was just like, these are the rhythms of creation.
That's right.
But when you look at the data, conservatives and likely a lot of Christians become a core part of this group that is skeptical about man-made climate change. And that strikes me as ironic because conservatism is kind of built off the idea of conserving, right? It's about
conservation.
Yeah, it's about conservation. That's where that word developed from. And yet there's a skepticism about how much human beings are able to do anything about it. So how do you address that? Because I know you're somebody who studies this deeply, study it theologically. Why do you think it is that conservatives and maybe Christians are skeptical about it?
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word skeptical because you did use the word denial. And I don't really talk about climate denialists because I think that's insulting. It feels like you're calling somebody a Holocaust denier or something like that. I think folks are properly skeptical. I used to be a climate skeptic back in the day, in the 80s and 90s when I was in college and grad school. I saw a lot of the basic science about climate change just coming out and becoming mainstream in the scientific community, though not really in public debate. And I was skeptical about it because it wasn't my field. I was in ecology and economics, and people in academia are always skeptical about other people's work until they have some cause to really dwell deeply on it. So it wasn't until the late 90s that I really started looking at the evidence around global climate change and understanding what it meant. And it didn't take long before I was convinced that it really was a global problem. Now, climatologists knew it was a problem back in the 70s, and the basic science behind climate change, that is the physics of the atmosphere and how carbon dioxide is like a blanket over the surface of the earth. This was known back in the 1800s. So none of this is really new science, but we've only in the last half of the 20th century had the data to be able to really test those hypotheses. Because even in the mid 1800s, some scientists were postulating that industrial pollution from the Industrial Revolution was going to eventually raise the temperature of the earth. And they thought that was a good thing, or scientific curiosity at best. But you couldn't really test that hypothesis until the mid 20th century, after World War II, when we'd put a lot of investment into meteorological research to do great weather forecasts for fighting World War II. The peacetime dividend was that we could use those data and those meteorological stations and measurements to test these hypotheses about how climate was changing. And the evidence began to marshal that it really was changing, and it was tied to carbon pollution in the environment that comes from industrial burning of fossil fuels.
So how would you say the conversation has maybe not gone the way that those who want to help people better understand climate has maybe gone off the rails? I mean, I think about Al Gore, for example, and others who became pretty famous for helping people wake up to the environment, wake up to the problems that could come. But was it too extreme? Did it go too far to basically, predict that, all the ice was going to melt, our cities were going to be flooded, but before 2020, I think there was predictions that it was going to happen sooner. Does that type of fear-based approach motivate people, or do you think we just kind of shut down a little bit and they're like, I don't believe that, so I'm not going to act?
Oh, I know that I'm subject to the same sort of fatalism when I come across folks who are climate obsessives. That is, that's all they talk about. It's just about gloom and doom. It's just about an impending apocalypse. And there's a fair amount of finger pointing that happens in that process too, that they want to find a guilty party and hang them out to dry. I think that these are problems that God has given us that we can work on together. And it's not that conservatives and progressives should line up on different sides of this debate, because if we're going to solve the problems that look like they're really real from a scientific point of view, like the science is more and more aligned, but division is about what kinds of policies would help us to deal with these issues. And here's where you get classic divisions between progressives who are pretty happy with big government solutions to big problems, and conservatives or libertarians who are more likely to want to see the free market unleashed to do its work and unleash corporate ingenuity on solving some of these problems. So I think you'll find in the future that most of the partisan divide, I would say within 5 to 10 years, is going to be around what the best solutions are for climate change, rather than whether it's happening or not, because that's becoming harder little island to stand on.
Well, and the Green New Deal was something that came up in the latest sort of policy prescriptions that really laid out a plan that was enormous in terms of one policy prescription of how you would solve some of the climate change. But the amount of money that costs, the amount of change that would require to a lot of people, I think made them reject it out of hand. But it's kind of like moving the Overton window, right? Where it's like the window now moved to what was possible in a way that beforehand people would never have even imagined retrofitting, tens of thousands of buildings and requiring certain things that would only be necessary if you wanted to travel, if you wanted to do certain activities, you have to follow these guidelines. Some of that started to push so far that now people might be imagining something more. Do you see a positive to sort of an imagination for environmental care that makes people get more creative in the short term, even if it doesn't play out the way that maybe that policy prescription lays out? Are there some wins in just creating that conversation?
Yeah, I'll betray some of my own political leanings in that I think the creativity is unleashed when you get market incentives lined up in the right way. So people are rewarded for doing things that are smart and that recognize the costs of their activities and endogenize them and bring them into their bookkeeping and their accounting, rather than as it is now, we expect to be able to run the economy in a certain way and have the costs of carbon pollution fall on other people and not reimburse them for those costs. So there is a concept in carbon pollution of thinking of the social cost of carbon. Like there's the cost of gasoline for driving in my car, but I don't pay anything for the fact that I get to send my exhaust out into the environment for free and impact lots of people's lives in Atlanta. But I could, through careful scientific analysis, understand a little bit about what those costs are. And if you put those costs into the price of gasoline, I'd think harder about buying a fuel-efficient car, and I might drive less and find some other ways to organize my life, not because some rule or regulation is standing in my way to keep me from doing something creative, but because the price reflects reality.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, though, when you get into these policy prescriptions. I don't know if you've read much about Tesla. I know people describe Tesla as something that would be great for the environment. It's an electric car, but the actual electricity that it takes to run a Tesla produces more pollution in creating the electricity that it needs than if you had a gasoline driven car. Have you heard that?
I haven't heard that about Teslas, but I know that a lot of people think that electric vehicles are zero emissions, and they're not emitting anything at the point, but there's a power plant somewhere that's generating the electricity that goes into charging up your electric vehicle.
Right.
So you have to do something that's like full life cycle, full cost accounting to be able to make judgments about these technologies. And that's a matter of prudence. That's back in the realm of economics. That's not in the realm of things that Christians would be disagreeing about, other than for ideological reasons or for theological reasons. It's just a matter of good bookkeeping.
That's where you being a resource economist comes into play. And that's what we were doing back at that first Q event. We were trying to analyze how much carbon would we use to make an event happen and how could we rectify that. I think I just love, Rusty, your thoughtfulness and how deep it runs. And you're not a headline guy. You're very much about what's true, and let's get to what's true. Let's think well about it. Let's be curious. I mean, these are all these aspects of Q that from the earliest days you helped shape, I know, and the DNA of what we're trying to accomplish. But I'd love to kind of conclude in this place of just talking biblical vision for caring about our creation and the environment. So for the Christian leader listening to this podcast and they fully buy into where the climate's going, our role in trying to prevent it, or the person who doesn't totally buy in and they're skeptical about man's role in this, you've always been able to break it down for me in a way that's just steps outside of those two polar places and helps the Christian recognize they have a responsibility with this creation, and it's incumbent upon all of us to participate. Would you describe more of that foundation?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to something that I think you were one of the first people I heard talking about on a public stage, this big 4-act drama of of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And if we put these environmental problems that are like they're little problems and set it against the backdrop of this big story of what God has done in the world, what people have done, what Jesus have done, and what Jesus is going to come back to do, it makes a whole lot more sense. At the beginning, God gave dominion over the planet to people. And that's kind of a crazy concept that two people living in a garden somewhere in Mesopotamia should somehow receive a mandate that says you are to rule over this world. And yet that's what God said. So we really do have dominion over the planet. And the fall didn't change that in a way. It warped it and distorted it. So the consequences that we see now, tens of thousands, millions of years later, in the way we run our economy, the fact that we should have a negative impact on creation really fits into our notion of what sin is, of what the fall is. It has consequences. So it shouldn't surprise us. In a sense, climate change as a problem from the way humans behave is the most plausible thing in the world from Christian theology. There's no area of life where our sin doesn't touch it and warp and distort, whether that's sexuality or economics or environment. But that's not where God left it. He came to redeem and restore that entire creation. As Colossians says that through Jesus' death on the cross, he is reconciling all things to himself. So in looking to solve these problems, we have the wind at our back. We have the creator of the universe who wants us to live back into that original job. We didn't just get fired from that job. He has redeemed us and restored us to that position as reconcilers. So this is just one of many problems where humans have to get busy as reconcilers and redeemers and folks that are looking to fix what's broken, because that's what Jesus wants us to do.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And the theological clarity of that vision of participating with God to restore things that are broken, to reconcile, and then to get creative about it. And that's what you've always been, is you're creative. You want it to work. You want people to be motivated and incentivized. And that's where I think our conversations can continue to get rich and more creative. Well, Rusty, thank you for your work at Tearfund USA. I want to tell everybody, go learn more about Tearfund USA. You can go to their website, tearfundusa.org, and see all of the work that they're doing and how you can play a role in impacting things. Their current initiative around women's empowerment. Rusty, tell us a little bit about the work Tearfund does for women's empowerment.
Oh, all around the world, we see the results of the church not giving adequate attention to the role of women in society and going along with the culture and being conformed to it instead of transforming it. So, 1 in 3 women worldwide are going to experience some sort of gender-based or sexual violence in their lifetime. 60% of the people who experience chronic hunger are women and girls. They own less than 20% of the world's land, and yet women produce the majority of the world's food. So even on this issue, on climate change, it affects women more than it does men around the world. So we really want to raise the profile of what women are doing by the grace of God, to raise their families, to care for their land, and to be leaders in their communities, because we see that when we invest in women and understanding their dignity, in helping men throughout the world understand what real masculinity is instead of the kind of cultural conforming masculinity they've grown up with, you see marriages restored, you see communities vibrant, able to benefit from leadership from men and women in those communities, and you see kids being able to flourish. So
yeah,
we really
awesome.
want to highlight the fact that it's awesome to invest in women.
It really is. I know in my travels internationally and looking at all the development work so many great organizations like Tearfund do, women are the leaders in these communities and villages, and the men are there supporting and helping, but you find so much creativity in these women who are resourceful, who know how to communicate well, bring people together, unite, and it's a beautiful thing. So I hope those listening, as you think about year-end giving, as you think about where you're supporting, this is a great way to help women around the world. Well, Rusty, we love you. We appreciate your thoughtfulness, and so great spending time with you today. I
love you too, Gabe. Good to be with you.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Rusty's just so thoughtful, and the work at Tearfund USA is just great. So check that out. And also, I just want to remind you, Rusty's talk is so good. The one on mapping environmental justice. You can go back and watch that 9-minute talk on Q Media. I know some of you already subscribe to Q Media, but if you don't subscribe, I mean, we're now in the month of December. You're going to have a little more time where you're hanging out with your family, you're hanging around, you're a little more time at home. You can either turn on like Hallmark and watch movies, or you can watch some great talks like this that your family would enjoy, your kids would enjoy. It would create great conversations around some really substantive topics. It's all mapped out into playlists where we talk about things like the environment, mental health, sexuality, you name it, the issue. We have talks on it that are relevant, that are current, that are by experts like people like Rusty, who can help you better understand our world and how faith applies to it. You can learn more about all that at qideas.org and just click on media and subscribe. It's $7.99 a month, and enjoy it and start to utilize this as a place to cultivate conversations in your family, in your team, in those that you love. Well, it's been another great conversation today. We're appreciative of you being a listener. Give us a review on wherever you listen to podcasts. Give us a review. We love hearing from you, and thank you for being a part of a community that seeks to learn and seeks to understand.